Today's discussion is addressing approaches to address structural racism. I would like to introduce you to your incredible presenter on the next slide, Jamila Nightingale, who is a clinical social worker at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital at Mission Bay, where she leverages her expertise in addressing systematic inequalities and promoting racial justice. A graduate of the University of Southern California School of Social Work, Jamila plays a critical role in the Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect SCAN program, where she not only supports vulnerable populations, but also challenges the structural biases that impact their care. With 18 years of experience as a child welfare worker with the City and County of San Francisco, Jamila has a deep understanding of the intersections of race, trauma, and institutional practices. Beyond her work with SCAN, if that wasn't enough, Jamila actively facilitates race-based affinity groups, provides leadership in the Behavioral Health Task Force, and collaborates with community partners to dismantle racism and foster equality in all areas of her work. With that, I want you to give what we say as a virtual round of applause. That would be hitting a reaction on your toolbar at the bottom. Hit a little emoji. It looks like a heart or a face. And those are going to float across the screen. Those are the virtual applause that we give to Jamila. And we want to say thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Hello, that was a wonderful introduction. I am really looking forward to moving through this training. Please feel free to ask any questions, put your questions in the chat. And I'm extremely passionate about this work for all of the reasons that you just heard. And there's so much content that I'd love to go ahead and just jump into that right now. So we'll go to the next screen. As we start off in this virtual presentation, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Indigenous American people that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Next slide. I've outlined a few community agreements. Together we know a lot, alone we don't know it all. We want people in this training to take space and also make space for others. Lean into discomfort. It's how we grow. Uphold what's confidential. What we learn leaves here. What we say stays here. And be sure to do your best. Be curious and respectful. Next. So today we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with our introduction. We're going to talk briefly about structural race. We're going to do a brief introduction about structural racism. That's going to be the topic of our conversation. We're going to go into a history of racism in the United States and the child welfare system. We're going to do a quick and deep dive in that area. And then we're going to head over into applying anti-racist pro-equity approaches to your child abuse response system. We're also going to talk about intersectionality and next steps. Next. The objectives are here for you to review. I'm not going to read them out right now, but it's also on the initial registration page. Thank you. Next. This is an interactive training. I really want you all to feel very comfortable with engaging, jumping in the chat, asking questions, utilizing the time in your breakout room. Once we get through introductions, we're looking to have a breakout room that with a group that you will stay with for the remainder of this session so that you could build upon establishing rapport with that group to really engage in the curriculum today. Next. So we're going to start off with introductions, your name, you'll meet out in the breakout group, your name and pronouns, your organization and your role in that organization, and the length of time in the field. As you will be working with each other throughout the session, we want this to be a great opportunity for you all get to know each other, the different perspectives, and we'd like for you to start off by answering one of the following questions. What do you hope to gain from this session? I'm so sorry. What do you hope to gain from this session? And what motivated you to attend this session? Third, you can also answer if you'd like, or you can answer if you'd like, where is your organization or team in the continuum of having discussions about structural racism, biases in your organization? Some of us are in the very beginning stages where organizations are really starting to have those conversations. Some of us are moderately engaged, and some of us are really doing some deep work at our institution. And some of us are in states or territories where there's a lot of restrictions around being able to engage in some of those conversations. So I think as we're developing relationships, it's nice to let those members of your breakout group understand where you and your organization are in that process. So thank you, and we will send you to your breakout group so you can meet the members of your breakout. Hello, thank you. We'd love to hear from one or two individuals that wants to share back around their group, anything that they were able to share or that they gained or learned from this check-in with members of your breakout.
And if you want to raise your hand in Zoom, we can unmute you and have you join us.
Zoe, yeah.
Hi.
Zoe, oh yeah, you're on.
Got you. I was trying to unmute myself, but it looks like you have control over that. So we were joking about potentially getting cut off while trying to wrap up our conversation, and of course, that's exactly what happened. But I really liked where that conversation was going. So like to invite people into these conversations, starting small. And Maria, thank you for this tool to start with things like, I'm privileged because I have a car, and something that's very relatable, right? Before we get into maybe these heavier discussion topics, I'm privileged because I have a job, or I'm privileged because of that. And then we can talk about privilege based on identity and kind of ease our way in. So I thought that was really cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Chinwe?
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Zoe, for sharing. In my group, what I really appreciated was the diversity amongst like job descriptions and why people are joining this training. It seems like a lot of people want to gain a lot of knowledge in my group. They talked about the knowledge they want to gain and how they want to implement that into their practice, and how this is just another building block of trying to understand and grow. So I really appreciated people's transparency around that and their transparency around how there's still room to grow, like specifically for them.
Thank you very much. If there's any information that anybody wants to type in the chat in terms of expectations, feel free to enter that. So as available, I can try to touch on some of those subjects if possible throughout the session if I don't already have like a specific slide around that. But thank you so much, Zoe and Chinwe, for sharing that information. Next slide. So we're going to be talking about structural racism in addition to talking about approaches to address structural racism. Next slide. So we'll start with structural racism describes the way in which, as our society becomes more sensitized to the reach and extent of structural racism embedded in our institutions, it's very important that we do serious and intentional work to undo the harmful policies and practices. The history of structural racism was present at the birth of this country's origin story, modern origin story in the 1600s. Examples that date back to the early 1600s includes the institutionalized genocide of Indigenous American people and the enslavement of and enslaved Africans on the United States country. So looking at the definition of structural racism, it describes the way in which social, political, economic, and cultural societal structures limit access to capital, power, and resources for certain racial groups and gives privilege, power, and resources to other racial groups, continually producing racial discrimination and racial inequity. And one of the things that I appreciated that Zoe held in her comment is, in looking at where do we start, I really made an effort to say, let's go deep into the history. I am going to go quickly through that, but there were so many different places to start, but that's where we're going to start in terms of using our history here in the US to really tangibly, in a concrete way, look at structures that um, typify structural racism. Next slide. So we're looking at the history of racism in the United States and child welfare systems. I understand that these are huge topics, and I'm going to try to go through them so that we have a discussion point when we're actually unpacking some of these skills in terms of how to approach structural racism. Next slide. The first settlers in America were a nomadic people who crossed a land bridge 19,000 to 26,000 years ago. They followed animal herds and evolved into the indigenous American tribes of the Western Hemisphere. This is a very simplified map of the indigenous tribes of where the US now occupies. According to the Houston Holocaust Museum, when European settlers arrived in the Americas in the 1600s, there were over 10 million indigenous American people living here. By 1900, 300 years later, their estimated population was 300,000. Some researchers identify the indigenous American people's population to be significantly above 10 million. So there is some estimate numbers of approximately 100 million, but all are in agreement that by 1900, their estimated population was 300,000. Indigenous American people were subject to many forms of violence, all with the intention of destroying their community. English settlers distributed blankets of smallpox to spread the disease, forced relocations, like the Trail of Tears, forced to walk from the deep South to Oklahoma. Several wars, civil rights violations were common, widespread massacres, violence was encouraged and incentivized. In the Penobscot tribe, Americans were incentivized for the murder of members of that tribe. There was cultural destruction through assimilation. I decided in this, next slide, that we would be looking at genocide. I really struggled, like I said, with where to start, and I could not jump into understanding structural racism without reviewing its conception here in the modern United States. I determined that the best way to understand the current impact of structural racism is to start with understanding very briefly the institutional genocide of the indigenous American people. Next slide. So when we're looking at structural racism, what we're looking at is a limit of access to power, resources, and capital for certain racial groups for the direct benefit of access and capital and power and resources for another racial group, producing racial discrimination and racial inequity. To me, I want to make sure that we're understanding the leverage of power to intentionally cause harm for the opportunity to increase wealth and power. Is important to understanding structural racism. Next slide. As settlers' demand for land increased, momentum grew to force indigenous American people further west. The genocide of Indigenous American peoples enabled states to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power. In 1860, the U.S. established the first of what came to be known as Indian boarding schools that still continue today. The goal was to assimilate Indigenous American youth into mainstream culture through education. Next slide. I want to make sure there are some large topics that we're going to be talking about. Please feel free to fact check me if you have more information or details on a specific fact that I share. I have done my best to get accurate and detailed information, and this is a space of learning. So please feel free to comment in the chat. We have a lot of information, so I may not always be able to pause and answer questions, although I will try. Please remember this is a learning space, so please share, especially if my information may be more outdated than information that you might have. Next slide. Due to time, I am only speaking about the atrocities committed against Indigenous American peoples. I apologize that we're not spending time reflecting on their history, cultural plurality, and societal contributions and overall resilience. At the end of this presentation, when we email information to you, we will share resources, books, and articles that speak to their many strengths. We were transitioning into understanding the ways in which structural racism negatively impacts others and benefits other racial groups, to really focus on how do we direct approaches to erase these structures. Next slide. Can you, looking at this slide, can you please enter in the chat if you know the significance of any of these dates, or if you would like to summarize the message you believe that this image is relaying? Do any of these dates seem to stick out or have meaning to anybody? Or when you look at this slide in general, what is it conveying? Civil rights? Thank you, Kathy. 2020 George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Thank you. While there's many things that this slide is clearly outlining, one of the things that it points to, one of the many things that it points to, is that for 246 years, there was the enslavement of Blacks in the United States, which currently, this slide was actually created in 2020 from the book that I received it from. Currently, that is 59% of the time of the modern United States, from the time that the settlers arrived in Jamestown. So from this time the settlers arrived in Jamestown to now, 2022, that is 59% of US history where Blacks were enslaved. Jim Crow was 92 years of US history and 22% of modern US history. And that means that we have a total of 81% of United States history in which Black people were either enslaved or restricted by some of the most grotesque laws that in the United States around segregation, Black codes, etc. So as we start to look at structural racism, I want to provide just a little bit of history so that we're very clear about the policies, the laws, the ways in which structures are created to limit access to control, power, resources, and provide the direct benefit for others. And we're looking at the issue of race. Some of the dates, 1607 is when the English settlers landed in Jamestown. 1619 was the arrival of slaves, refers to the documented landing of a group of enslaved Africans in Virginia. 1814 is when Britain, April 1814 proclamation made a promise that the British would welcome those who departed the United States, aimed at enslaved Africans. So that was an opportunity for enslaved Africans to potentially partner with the British so that they could gain their freedom. 1865 is the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. And 1877 is so from 1865 to 1877, we have the Reconstruction era, which I would love to go into, but we will continue on. And then we have Jim Crow from 1877 to 1969. Next slide. We're going to talk about, in the same way we're just looking at policies to look at structural racism, we're going to look at the history of child welfare policies, and we're going to put an overlay on that around structural racism. And we're going to open a link. Is that available in the chat? Okay. I'm really, here we go. So in the 1700s, what we're going to be looking at are we're looking at the development of child welfare policies here in the United States, and then we're going to take an overlay as we look at ways in which child welfare policies negatively impacted American indigenous peoples and Black people. So in the 1700s, orphans and children's parents who could not care for them were often indentured to work for other families. Around the 1800s, you had a host of religious and charitable organizations that created orphanages. And then there became some concerns around the 1850 about whether or not orphanages were appropriate and people should be placed with, and children should be placed with families. Unfortunately, these families were rarely screened and placements were not monitored. In the 1900s, we saw the first state laws to prevent child abuse and neglect being passed. The first national conference was held. We had the first Children's Bureau in the United States, and the first federal grants for child welfare were created, which was the start of child welfare agencies. In 1935, the Social Security Act established aid to dependent children. And that provided financial assistance to needy dependent children. In 1950, policymakers became aware that many needy children were being denied benefits under regulations regarding concept of suitable homes or man-in-the-house policies. We were finding that unwed mothers and there were accusations of immorality as it relates to individuals being denied benefits. A few things that are important. In 1948, Harry Truman ends segregation. And so we have many Black families that are migrating from the South to new homes and new communities and seeking new jobs. At that time, there was not a stigma against receiving ADC. And shortly after Harry Truman ends segregation, we see significant increase in Black families applying for ADC. And then within 2 years, the federal government begins to notice that there's a huge spike in denials that are taking place. In 1960, Louisiana had expelled approximately 23,000 children from welfare because because there were children that were born outside of marriage. The National Urban League actually partnered to look for changes that would benefit families. And the Fleming Rule was established by the Department of Health and Education and Welfare. And the Fleming Rule was like, you cannot simply ignore the needs of children living in households that are deemed unsuitable. So what the states required was you need to provide services that make homes suitable, or remove children from their homes and place them into a suitable home, and then provide those families with financial assistance. States on top of that were provided matching federal funds for foster care payments made on behalf of children that were removed from unsuitable homes. And these matching funds were only available for our poorest and most marginalized families. If you were a middle income family and you did not qualify for aid, then the federal government would not reimburse the states if those children were removed from their homes. So what we see is in the 1960s that we're have an increased rate of removal, where prior in the 1700s, when we were looking at helping children and families, it was voluntary for primarily white families to say, I need help, I need somebody to care for my kid, I'm a widow, I need support. And as Black families began to enter the system, we see a very negative backlash and an increased rate of denial. We see forced removal of children from homes. In 1962, amendments also required that state agencies report families to the court system whose children were identified for removal. And there was a significant growth of number of children entering foster care in the 60s. Other things that were happening that's really important in terms of some of the changes, in 1957 was the Civil Rights Voting Act. It was the first civil rights legislation since the end of Reconstruction in 1877. And that was followed by 96 years of Jim Crow. And then in 1957, we finally see that the federal government says that they will prosecute or obtain court injunctions against interference with the right to vote. And then in 1965, Black women earned the right to vote. And I just juxtapose those things on top of the growth of rights and access that's happening for Black people in relationship to what's happening around some of our child welfare policies and laws. In 1967, foster care became mandatory for all states. In 1974 was the creation of CAPTA, and in exchange for federal funding, CAPTA required states to initiate mandate reporting laws. And by 1975, each state was required to establish a formal child welfare agency. And there was an engagement in a lot of race-neutral approaches that centered white normality benchmarks in assessing appropriate behaviors and good parenting. In 1978, ICWA was established without enforcement or oversight. Very important things to understand is that by 1970, 25 to 30% of all Indigenous American children had been removed from their homes and placed into foster care. What were called Indian boarding schools had grown to number 357 in 30 states. And over a period of time, they had housed approximately 60,000 youth, totaling 83% of all Indigenous American children. In the 80s and 90s, Black women were 10 times more likely to be reported to child welfare. The percentage of children that aged out of the system increased by 41% from 1998 to 2007. In 1996, the Adoption and Safe Family Act focused on terminating parental.
Oh, you got muted.
Thank you so much. I apologize for that. Following the promotion of ASFA, In 2019, the number of children waiting for adoption had doubled. So there were policies that fast-tracked terminating parental rights and creating permanent separations for children and families, and we did not see an improvement in children receiving permanent homes or not languishing in foster care. We saw an increase. Slide. Any questions? I know that was a handful, but I really wanted to have an opportunity to look at the ways in which child welfare codified a lot of laws and practices and policies that were in direct relationship across a timeline to Black families beginning to enter the system and access the system as they were getting various rights and opportunities. Any questions either in the chat or anybody want to raise their hand? We'll go into erasing institutional bias. Slide. Of the types of intergroup processes that exist today, institutional bias is one of the least understood by social scientists and remains relatively untouched by theoretical approaches, particularly in social psychology. The goal of this section is not to focus on the consequences of institutional bias. Instead, what we're going to be focusing on are issues concerning its cause and perpetuation, areas that have received much less research and focus. Institutional bias is defined during this training are laws and customs and practices which systematically reflect and produce group-based inequalities in any society. An institution may be biased whether or not the individuals maintaining those practices have biased intentions. And that's what I want to talk about. I think one of the perspectives I've constantly had is that it's the individual biases of the people in an institution that create the institutional bias. And we're going to have an opportunity to look at some research that shares a different perspective. So when we're looking at erasing institutional bias, some of the strategies that we're going to be looking at are identify an umbrella goal. In terms of creating a workplace or organizational culture that really normalizes dealing with institutional bias rather than implicitly forcing employees to internalize their bias. So in this approach, we're going to be looking at our step one as starting with yourself. Slide. And these are the various types of bias that present at our institutions: occupational bias, gender bias, racial bias, hiring or advancement bias, customer bias, and retribution bias. Next slide. One of the first steps in erasing institutional bias, which is a book that provides some concrete skills around moving forward in this, is one of the first things they talk about is evaluating your old role. Developing a self-awareness about how you engage the system. It is difficult to be a credible change maker and ally when you are actively perpetuating the problems you aim to correct. So it's taking an opportunity to look at what is the specific bias in relationship to those that I just named that's at issue at your institution. How is it affecting you? How am I hurt or limited by this process? How is it affecting my colleagues? How might this benefit specific demographics? And so it's an opportunity to look at these series of questions for an opportunity for self-reflection. Next slide. As you're defining your new role in breaking down systemic bias, what contribution do you want to make as it relates to the specific institutional bias you've identified? power, leverage, or influence do you have in your institution? We want to make sure that you are not doing this alone, right? You want to assess power, leverage, and influence. You want to understand your boundaries, truly assess if you have established the relationships, skill, training, networks, and or if there are still opportunities for you to build your strengths prior to taking on this challenge. Are you willing to personally champion this cause? And please put in the chat if there's any questions. Don't hesitate. The other thing that we're looking at in terms of the personal change framework is cultivating allies. How will I handle objections and naysayers? How will I communicate my level of commitment? Really wanting to make sure you're not doing this alone, that one person on a crusade can, if you can get a team of diverse individuals that see a shared value in this process, you have the makings of change. And creating a movement. A movement is just a group of people who share a collective passion to get something done. One of the managers at Children's Hospital started off in her career, and prior to becoming a manager, when she was what she would refer to as a baby social worker, one of the first organizations that she worked at, they had policies in place so that their staff was reflective of the community, racially reflective of the community that they worked with. When she went on to become a medical social worker, she found that the staff was primarily white and not reflective of the community where she worked. She was there for about 20 years before she became a manager. And at that time, she had established a significant amount of leverage, networking, community. She knew the system. She understood how it worked. She had a lot of relationships there. And she made a commitment to really reflect on what was her old role and what did she want to do different. And she had an opportunity to ask herself, what was her new role going to be? And she thought back to when she was a baby social worker. Those are her terms, and that she wanted to really spend an opportunity to look at the structure at her organization to see how she could also set up an opportunity for the staff at her agency and her department to be reflective of the community that they serve. In order to do that, she was able to bring together a team of very like-minded individuals in various levels of the department to talk about what would need to happen in order for those things to move forward. And she was able to create, as this model says, create a movement in terms of staying focused on really addressing hiring and practices at the hospital, and really having had an opportunity to ask herself, like, how are you going to handle objections and naysayers? How will I communicate my level of commitment? And she was able to use some of the skills found in this model to help navigate those changes. Next slide. So policy implementation has 4 components. Policies have to be created and written down, obviously. Second, the intent of the wording has to be interpreted, right? We all see, when we read it, we all have a very different perspective sometimes. Third, the policy has to be put into practice or implemented. Lastly, it has to be received or experienced by real people in real settings. And so we're going to start talking about policy. So next slide, sorry. So one of the things I had said earlier is that you can have unbiased individuals, and you can still have an institution that engaged in biased practices. It's easy to include, so if we look at this chart here, one of the things that happens is that you can have a sum of individuals that engage in intentional, explicitly group-based practices, hiring choices based on candidate sex, police harassing African Americans based on race. And some of these are in quadrant one, those are intentional, major group-based inequalities, right? Through the discriminating acts of a critical mass of individuals who are agents of, public or private agencies. What we see in quadrant two, below, is the intentional written or unwritten rules, laws, or procedures that lead to differential outcomes for members of different racial groups. And for quadrant two, what this research looks into is unbiased agents could still provide inequalities. For example, if a prison guard or a fighter are engaged in hiring decisions and there's a height requirement, they might believe that they're engaging in logical and rational decision making as it relates to this policy, but it still creates a bias in terms of they might have less women that they're bringing into these positions because of the height bias. Quadrant three is unintentional, and quadrant four, in the bottom right-hand corner, is unintentional, but this is the most dangerous and controversial. These standards of practice are based entirely on what appears to be rational and superficially like unbiased policies. And these are procedures that do not seem on the surface to target specific groups directly. So for example, you have like insurance companies that use actuary tables based on really like objective, economically driven standards for determining their policy premiums. But if social groups are more likely to fall under a risk category, for example, you live in a home in lower income locations with little access to services, then the members of that group are more likely to pay higher premiums despite the rational and objective nature of the policy. Do you have any questions? The fourth section seems to fall under intentional. One of the things that this research looks into when they're looking at the fourth quadrant and why they say that it's unintentional is because it seems logical and rational, right? Oh, if we haven't, it's not, it's policies that are put in place without taking the time to see how that impacts groups and people, and without having that self-reflection. So if this is one of the ways when what they're saying is, it's not our fault that it's not our fault that this racial community has higher falls or has higher negative outcomes that make them ineligible for this program. Maybe if this community did something different, there wouldn't be a problem, as opposed to understanding that that this policy consistently causes harm to this community. And so those are the reasons why they're saying that quadrant 4 is unintentional. And there's some people that will say, I didn't even realize that there was a bias. I didn't even realize that this policy more negatively impact a certain group. I just thought that anybody that had this outcome, should not have access to XYZ. I'm going to read one more part and then I'll go ahead and I'll answer your question, Zoe, or make your question available. When we're looking at interventions, and this is the one that was a little difficult, but I wanted to be sure to share it as we're looking at approaches to structural racism. What it talks about here is that those in quadrant 1 that are intentional, those are opportunities to have discrimination lawsuits for protected class or a formal reprimand. I'm going somewhere with this one. And then for quadrant 2, where it's intentional, that these are opportunities to potentially look at civil rights violations. And one of the things that I think is really important as we're looking at structural racism is there's currently a lot of laws that are coming out in different states and federally also that are really limiting some of those opportunities that have previously or for a short period been available to really contest or challenge. I don't know where everybody's from, but I do know that there are several national conferences or a few national conferences that I've been able to attend and talk to colleagues from different states really talk about how hard it is to implement some of these changes and that there's very little discourse at this time. So I think that's a really important thing for us to be looking at when we're looking at structural approaches to structural racism, because we're not receiving, the courts are making different choices. Zoe?
Hi. I'm gonna try and word this elegantly, but I'm probably gonna fail. So I wear a few different hats, but I'm a transgender woman, but before that I was teaching before I transitioned, and something that I felt, because I've gone to similar trainings and I've tried to navigate and have this distraction, but this tension that I felt internally, it was always like, one of my, or a group of my identities was at that time like middle class white male. And I acknowledged that I had a lot of opportunities that other groups didn't have. And sometimes in my classroom settings, I felt like I was trying to be an ally, but somehow very representative of institutional bias just from opportunities I was afforded through the years. And so I'm trying to formulate a specific question, but I'm like, how do I acknowledge that and help change institutions from within, even though I myself maybe am, I don't want to say part of the problem, but like I represent some of the issues, or I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you. I think that was one of the reasons I wanted to share. The manager that I spoke of is a white woman, and when she had the opportunity to say, I have a new opportunity, and looking at this kind of 4-step process around erasing institutional bias, she said to herself, I know where I've been, and I know the things that I know I can do. How do I reflect on this old role that I had? And what were the ways in which I believe in it that I may have perpetuated certain biases? And what is the new way that I want to show up, centering, um, focusing on a very specific bias? And thank you, Zoe, for sharing that. I think all of us show up with different levels of privilege, and I think it's very important for all of us to have an opportunity to say, what are the new ways that I want to show up where I'm able to identify very specific areas in my institution that I want to build a group, build a team, be able to leverage the power or privilege or network that I have established or that I'm willing to establish in this agency so that I can affect change. Thank you, Zoe. Kathy?
Hi, I wanted to comment on what Maria Cruz Mejia put into the chat about the Spanish speaking only and hiring. At our organization, I work for one of the regional centers. We created a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging team. And within that team, it was primarily language based. And so there was some feedback that was provided about, well, it doesn't fully reflect who we serve. We're looking at little slivers of population that may only speak specific languages, but it was confusing to think about how the diversity is if you're saying, well, everyone needs to speak this certain language. I mean, of course, there's a need for various languages to be spoken to support individuals that we serve, but how can that more reflect, because there isn't anyone that's African American on that team. And I know that, we're not going to pick everyone from every single culture necessarily, but digging a little deeper to see what the beliefs are with those people is not just the language that you speak, but it's who you are, how you're, how you are connected to people in general. And, how do you put that into practice? So it's just more of a comment, but I think that it's something that's gotten to the point for us of like, wow, there's certain ones, even the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging supervisor position was only, you had to be Spanish speaking. You thought, okay, well, that maybe there's a benefit to that in somewhere, but everyone else that's on the team, is bilingual in other languages. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing. It moves us into our breakout session. So if we can go to the next slide, and then if Dr. Barbara Stroud can make their comment. Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing. I think it'll be an important thing to review in this next
Jamila,
breakout session.
I want to thank you for this amazing training and all of your thoughtful, really, really deep reflections. And I'm going to be quick. I'm noticing some feelings in my body. And I just want to say, if you're out there and you're noticing some feelings in your body, because white supremacy culture cuts us off from our body and tells us to all be intellectual and thoughtful. But some of those feelings in my body, I'm not always able to attend. And I'm noticing that for myself. And I just want other people to, if you're noticing that for yourself, my ancestors are speaking as you're talking and as I'm listening, and I'll let you move to the breakout group.
I'd like to say thank you very much. I've been noticing that feeling within my body even while I'm coming up with this, the curriculum for this. So I would like for us to have an opportunity to speak to that after we get through the breakout room. But thank you so much for bringing that up. I appreciate you bringing words to that. If we have an opportunity to kind of spend some time reflecting on what is the institutional bias that you have observed at your organization? We had a couple that we listed around racism, gender. Oh, great. We have the document. What is one bias that you feel is so I'm not going to read this because you guys are going to have it in the breakout. I'm going to let you all go. If you want to speak to what you're feeling in the way that Dr. Barbara Stroud pointed out, please feel free to do that too. The goal is to share and to figure out how we're going to be able to have enough self-reflection to identify what kinds of strategies, what kinds of ways we want to engage our organization. And thank you very much. We'll send you to breakout rooms now. Okay, thank you. If we could have one or two individuals speak to what they might have shared or what they feel like they might have learned as a process of participating in the breakout group. Shinwei?
Yes, I think for me, when I shared in my group, in all transparency, it had a little bit of a hard time trying to break down the quadrants in my past work situation. And that is because I feel like as someone who, as a person of color in my workplace, I was very much gaslit into kind of not really fully understanding like why I was brought in. I was brought in to be that quote unquote token person, and I didn't know at the time because from our head staff were predominantly white women. It made it seem like I was supposed to be there, but when we would have conversations about it, it would be like no. They would flip it around, and it would be really, really what the word I use, gaslighty. So I kind of talked about my experience around that because I feel like people in my group had very, at least more specific, concrete institutional biases that they noticed. And I think for me, someone who came from an institution that wasn't as straightforward with it, it felt very under the radar, very unintentional. I don't know if that really makes sense, but I kind of wanted to express that because I don't know if anyone else kind of felt that coming up, but that's how I felt personally.
Thank you. I think that sometimes when we're looking outward, we have an opportunity to feel like there's a sense of potential clarity around the issues, but when we're involved and engaged, it really takes an opportunity to have a colleague or a peer to really help us like kind of pull back the onion and really try to see what we're holding in those spaces. But it could be very convoluted. So sometimes it almost takes a couple of years when we're looking at how the organization impacted us. So I think that's a very real difficulty in terms of understanding which ways the organization may have been negatively impacting ourselves in different ways that it might be a little bit more clarity when we're looking at ways in which the organization might have a larger impact externally or with others. So I think that's a very real obstacle that many of us face. Thank you for sharing that. Maria?
I was gonna, oh,
Hi, I just wanted to add, I was the one that put in the chat about the Spanish speaking, and I elaborated on in the break session about, when I applied for the position, I thought it was a great thing that you needed to speak Spanish to be able to communicate with the population that I was serving. But 2 years in, I realized that it is an advantage, and at the same time, it's a disadvantage because I do have other clients that are African American and only speak English. And when we have events or when we have like parenting classes, it only addresses Spanish speaking. So, how do you not challenge that, but like how do you bring awareness to that it is a limitation, even though maybe the intention is to serve that community, but it's not only Spanish based, and um I think Zoe asked like how is it an advantage or a disadvantage? And we kind of just spoke about that and yeah.
Thank you so much, Maria, for providing a little bit more clarification for me on that one. I think that we consistently run into difficulty when we're looking at um, our 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 most marginalized and our smallest population, right? So if we have a community and maybe our community is 3% or 5%, and we're like, this community has really negative outcomes or their needs aren't being met as well by this organization, and we still need to improve their ability to develop rapport, to feel connected, et cetera. So I think looking at ways that we're able to identify, although our resources might benefit 60% or 40% of our population, how do we look at meeting the needs of our more fragmented populations and ensuring that they have, and this is one of the things we're looking at with structural outcomes, structural racism, is are we finding that certain racial groups, that their outcomes are negatively impacted because we're not taking the time to really specifically look at the supports and the services that they need. One of the other things that erasing institutional bias, there's a book that they talk about is they also have a series of steps to look at in terms of really implementing. So I think once we have an opportunity to do the self-reflection, to say, what is the bias that I see in this institution? And what are the ways that I can partner with others so that we can improve outcomes for our more marginalized or our smaller communities, our smaller racialized communities, is an opportunity to begin to have that discussion with the organization potentially. But those are the hard parts, right? We're so busy moving and providing those direct level services that sometimes it's hard to take away the time to really focus on that system. Brietta? Did I pronounce your name correctly,
It
Brianna?
Brita.
Brita, thank you. I'm sorry.
So in our group, we also talked a little bit about sort of tokenism, and there was a really rich conversation around the ways in which within our organization there's still this notion of bias around a person's name, whether that be first or last name, the way a person looks, assuming that you look a certain way, so you must speak Spanish, or you become sort of like the token person that's being asked to give advice, or that's the go-to for information. And I spoke, more specifically about my organization, where um, I think it's important that people from different cultures are able to speak and tell their own stories. But when an organization decides that you are the only person that can speak and tell that story, then you become tokenized as the subject matter expert on all things about your culture. So, for example, I, as a Black African American woman, can't write an article about racism that's specifically focused on Hispanic or Latinx communities, because I'm not from that community. And so, again, it's important that persons from the Hispanic and Latinx community can speak to their experience, but I also think it's equally important that others, and we talked about this in our group, other people might have more information or additional information about that culture than even the person that's raised and is from that culture. So just important to be able to sort of recognize both sides, but give opportunities for people to speak and to share about different cultural experiences, whether they're from that culture or not.
Thank you, Brita. One of the things that's important in the eliminating racial bias, institutional bias, it really focuses on having an opportunity to identify clear data points. Because one of the things that we want to look at, in addition to finding our voice and speaking to that and providing services, supports, literature, etc., is what is our impact? And so one of the things that we really want to be looking at when we're looking at structures and systems and institutions is, prior to us being engaged, being involved, how are racial groups' outcomes as a result of engaging with these systems? And once we get involved and once we start to implement changes and strategies, being able to continue to look at the data to see what is the impact on this community as a result of that level of engagement, so that and that keeps us at a more of a systems approach around it. So thank you so much for highlighting the ways in which different people are able to engage in that process and allowing me to share some of the other aspects of data that that we didn't bring into the conversation yet. I'm really excited to go into structural competency, if that's okay with the group. Structural competency is next slide, is an approach that is really taking off in the medical field. And when you look at this, there's a lot of social workers here. When you're looking at this chart as a social worker, what social work 101 theory does this remind you of? When we're looking at structures, policies, economics, systems, and then we're looking at what the medical field identifies as social determinants, some of the ways in which these systems might be negatively impacting, or you have limited access, public health approach, thank you. And then looking at health disparities in terms of what are the inequitable health outcomes that we see as a result of this. I want to say, like, when I initially heard about the structural competency model, next slide, I minimized it because to me, it really sounded like social work systems theories. And I was like, social work, we already know how to do that. But having an opportunity to really dive deeper into structural competency, I really appreciate it as a tool. I'm around approaches to structural racism. Structural competency is not just focused on helping families navigate systems, but it's focused on improving systems' ability to provide like a clear pathway that produces improved outcomes for families. According to Park, one of the things that I had to take in is structures are pretty much relegated to the margins of social work education and practice. And I was a community organizing, a macro focus in social work school, and I still appreciate what Park is saying, in that we tend to relegate structures to the margins of our social work practice and education in favor of individualized analysis and intervention. Park further states that social workers, that we can ultimately promote their clients, and fortunately, we sometimes can promote their capacity to accommodate and not really to actively change their social political environments. We're including, and that includes their interactions with us and with social work in general. Next slide. So for me, the interesting thing about structural competency approach is the focus on, and I'll go to next slide, that once we understand what our families are dealing with in terms of their difficulty in navigating systems, it's not just a fact for us to be aware of, but it needs to become a condition that has to be changed and challenged. Next slide. So structural competency, I was gonna, does anybody want to read the slide? Anybody want to volunteer to read a slide?
I can.
Thank you.
Centers the influence of social, political, and economic structures on the degree and distribution of health disparities. Articulates the need for providers to recognize and respond to the structural factors, from labor markets and zoning laws to criminal justice policies and trade agreements. The impact health outcomes that impact
okay.
health outcomes and the practice of healthcare. Its core component of recognizing the upstream factors that impact individual. I think that's supposed to say individuals.
Typo,
And then,
sorry.
yeah, no worries. And community well-being while working collectively to address them resonates with social workers' principles of empowerment, social justice, and advancing human dignity.
What I hope I'm outlining around structural competency is that it's an opportunity for us to look at systems, but look at systems change, as opposed to focusing on changing the individual and finding problem and fault with the individual because they have a difficulty navigating the system. Next slide. This theory is not just focused on helping families like navigate systems, but focused on improving the system's ability to provide clear pathways that produce improved outcomes for family. I'm just repeating that again. So the first thing that I like about this is that it talks about a hierarchy. And one of the things that happens in the medical profession is the doctors, power, privilege, proximity have this unspoken hierarchy, and the social workers have a different space in the hierarchy. What the structural competency model is saying is we want to provide teaching, instruction, training, interdisciplinary that removes some of that so that it's an opportunity to use shared language across disciplines so that we are able to hear and understand what happens across disciplines so that we can partner to make these kinds of systems changes. What I really appreciated about that is I believe that when we're engaging with child welfare as community-based agencies, that sometimes there's that similar hierarchy of power and privilege in terms of the child welfare worker and their decision-making for the families. And I'm going to forward to the next slide, but I think that structural competency could provide an opportunity for many of us that are looking for creating safe spaces for children, keeping them in their homes and keeping them connected with their loved ones, having a structural competency seems like a great opportunity for us to have a stronger focus on these systems and not just making an assessment of whether or not a family's inability to navigate a system is indication of a problem with the family. Next slide. We're going to go ahead and take another breakout, and let's use this time to meet with your group to discuss. If you have an opportunity, when we're looking at structural competency, if you have an opportunity to identify 2 to 3 structures that you are aware of negatively impact the overall safety and well-being of children and families that access services at your agency, using that. Oh, and you guys already have it. I don't have to read it. If you could please make your way to your breakout rooms.
We have a quick thought from a production standpoint to help keep the session on track with time. Would you be open to this being a group discussion in this main room if we have a couple volunteers? Awesome.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. So it sounds like the first question is identify 2 to 3 structures that negatively impact the overall safety and well-being of children and families that access services at your agency. Instead of popping into our breakouts, would you populate those into the chat, please? 2 to 3 structures that negatively impact the overall safety and well-being of children and families that access services at your agency.
And one of the things that I'll highlight when I bring that up is sometimes there's certain organizations that we know we provide referrals to, and we know they just lost the most amazing executive director, and their interim is, that there's a lot of turnover, there's been a lot of new people, that the receptionist is no longer there. So this is not condemning systems, but there are systems sometimes where we know if a family got referred there in the last 6 months, we are aware that those systems have not been effective. So it's an opportunity to acknowledge that we often will make referrals when we know that there's a system that is not reaching the kind of intended outcomes that we were hoping for that family upon making that referral. Thank you. And part of this is to acknowledge that we have an awareness about some of these systems, and because we're focused on helping the individual, sometimes we don't put in place the kind of tools necessary to really say to these systems, what's happening? Like, we need to look at how we can attend to the fact that right now your outcomes are negatively impacting some of the families that we're sending to you, because it can't just be a fact to be known. It has to be something we start to challenge. Okay, thank you so much. We're going to go to the third. Yes. Thank you so much. We're going to go to the third approach, and it's racism as a root cause approach. And if you can go to the next slide. So the racism as a root cause approach, what it says is it looks at one, precise impact. And I hope that's something that you're identifying in these 3 different approaches. It's always figuring out, where am I going to start? And it's okay if you're not sure yet. It's giving yourself some time to say, what are the parts of this system that seem broken or flawed or causing significant enough harm for families or poor enough outcomes that I really want to spend time and focus on? And so it's looking at what is the precise impact. Second, focuses on what are the systems changes that need to take place in terms of policies, system, or environments, as opposed to changing people. So racism as a root cause is very similar to what we're looking at in structural competency. It's taking the focus off of the failures of the family, the inappropriate behaviors of the family, and saying these systems are difficult to navigate. And we need systems that are going to be more responsive to the families that need to utilize them. And then it talks about in racism as a root cause approach, what is the long-term goal or approach? Because the worry is if we have a short-term 6-month, 9-month program where we don't have sustainable funding, where we don't have a larger systemic way of looking at how to grow that program, that it doesn't allow for the kinds of outcome change that we're looking at. And what I enjoy about what racism as a root cause approach identifies is looking at reparations, and it's seeking to repair historical injustice by shifting resources, power, and opportunities to marginalized racial groups. And I talked about a manager that decided that they wanted to make a change. And one of the things that I appreciated in the ways that I don't think that we think when we're talking about reparations in this larger outside conversations, but as we're talking about in this approach to structural racism, is one of the things that she identified was it wasn't just about hiring, it was also about training. Because one of the things that they made a decision to do is ensure that in their hospital, in their children's hospital, they had a robust internship program. And they also made a commitment to ensuring that they had diversity, not just as it related to the students, but also the universities that they went to seek students and engage students. And so the goal was we have not been a community partner in the way that I think we should, and building the kinds of diverse connections and opportunities. Because as many of you know, to become a medical social worker, you often need that 6 months of experience or a year. And so without that internship, it doesn't allow you opportunity or access unless you do per diem. So she was thinking in a larger way, like, how do we really create significant opportunities for for new workers from diverse backgrounds to be hired and to be successful at our hospital. So when we're talking about reparations, I don't want us to get caught up in this exchange of cash, but really looking at how do we right the wrongs of whatever harm has been caused to ensure that we are providing access to power, privilege, and control for the benefit of increased outcomes for the families that we serve. Next slide. And so this is looking at being precise in focus. This is the chart that we'll be looking at. Although this may feel contrary to how many of us have been taught to practice clinical and public health, we need to give ourselves permission to explicitly focus on specific racially marginalized communities rather than engaging in color blindness and equality frameworks. One of the things that this research looks at is we know that racism negatively impacts outcomes for our families. And when we see it, call it. Get the data, understand what you're speaking on, and then identify ways in which we can positively improve the outcomes for those families. And if you have identified structural racism, you have to call it for what it is. And two, looking at systems change. The implicit assumption underlying these types of programs is that a lack of education, efficacy, resilience, and our motivation is what keeps some communities from achieving their maximum potential without recognizing the ways in which some of these larger structures fail our families. Next slide. And this will be our last breakout group. This is going to be one that is going to have an opportunity to look at one of the two approaches that we've talked about today. So when we're looking at racism as a root cause, that's an opportunity if you have, and each breakout group will decide, but to look at a very specific impact and how that's something that you can look at changing in your system by going through those 4 things. And for looking at erasing institutional bias, that's an opportunity for groups that are like, I just want to focus on where I need to start right now, because there's some work that I need to do in terms of self-reflection and figuring out where I'm showing up in this organization and what are the specific ways that I want to present and engage differently to make a more positive impact in my organization that improves outcomes for families. So we will, and it would be nice if we're able to utilize this framework to review and develop a solution addressing inequalities in CPS reporting, to focus on some of our issues around child welfare, especially with your organization. Please, you'll be assigned to your breakout groups to connect with your community in your breakout session, and we will see you afterwards. Thank you, everybody, for your participation in the breakout session. I'm very interested to hear any feedback. If there's anybody, 1 or 2 people that want to share what they learned or what they shared in the group. Thank you, Zoe.
So our group actually had a lot of really good conversations in a lot of different respects, but we like some of the questions we asked, like practical kind of stuff, was someone brought up like, is this helping the community and who is it excluding, right? Like if those are the questions you're asking in your institution, it's kind of putting you on the right track. We talked about looking at people's intent as well as the impact that is made. So not ignoring either of those things, because and we also talked about trying to like get people on board to learn. Because I think this is me not speaking for whole group, but like sometimes it's easy to be upset when somebody says something that's not malicious but ignorant. But if instead of being upset, or at least if we can keep that internal, maybe we can use that as a point of learning, I think that you're more likely to kind of bring people along. I think that, what do they call it? Like calling in versus calling out.
Thank you for sharing that, Zoe. I know one of the things when it's when I'm looking at opportunities to really implement structural change, it requires a lot of listening. It's a great opportunity to really get to understand the depths of where different members of your team are, and understanding how to, as one of the approaches talks about, understanding how to leverage your network and your power and your privilege in order to create improved outcomes for our marginalized families. Thank you. Is there anybody else that would like to share? Oh, and then we can talk about allies after. Elisa, I'm sorry, I apologize if I pronounced it incorrectly.
No, you're okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Elise Bejarano. I just basically saying what Zoe was saying. I was in the same group with her, and I think what we need to start with is just by being a good person and allowing people to just be who they are and to speak. And I think that's like one of the main things I try to do in like my own practice, is just allowing myself to change and grow when it comes to like my knowledge. And it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to just, I'm not saying it's okay to be ignorant, but it's okay to just, not know everything. And I think that's the one thing I'm for sure taking away of this, is that it's okay to not know and to expand my knowledge on things. And I just appreciate this. I appreciate you and your expertise.
Thank you. I would like to add, thank you, Elise, for adding all of those things. I appreciate that. I wanted to add, I see in the comment, can someone add about cultivating allies? And this will probably be our last comment. Is there anybody who wants to share about cultivating allies, any tips or tools that they've been able to utilize? And then we can close out. One of the things I want to add, if it's okay, about cultivating allies is, a lot of times when we're at work, we develop relationships based on friendships and possibly mentorships, but people that are in close proximity, people that are within our unit. When we're looking at systems change, it is very important that one, we've done the research to know what group is being marginalized and has negative outcomes, and who are the people, players, and people in positions of power and leadership that can affect change. And what opportunities do you have access to them? And they don't always have to be at the top of leadership. They might be some really key people in your own unit that work in various levels that you didn't think of. We're going to go ahead and pull this to an end. And I just want to say thank you so much. I appreciate all of you for taking the time to participate. Thank you for engaging with your breakout sessions in the way that you did. And thank you for being open to learning and hearing about this process. And while I know we do a lot of work focusing on the individual, I really challenge all of you to continue to look at the structures the systems that we're engaging in and referring our families to, and focus on opportunities that you might be able to create to help those systems improve their outcomes for our most marginalized families. Thank you.